Russian forces are escalating their onslaught against Ukrainian positions around the wrecked city of Bakhmut, Ukrainian officials said, bringing new levels of death and devastation in the grinding, months-long battle for control of eastern Ukraine that is part of Moscow's wider war. The Kremlin, whose invasion of its neighbor 10.5 months ago has suffered numerous reversals, is hungry for any victories. Russia illegally annexed Donetsk and 3 other Ukrainian provinces in September, but its troops have struggled to advance. After Ukrainian forces recaptured the southern city of Kherson in November, the battle heated up around Bakhmut. The UK Defence Ministry concurred with that appraisal of the battle developments. Russian troops alongside soldiers from the Wagner Group, a Russian private military contractor, have advanced in recent days in Soledar and are likely in control of most of the settlement, the ministry tweeted Tuesday. It said that taking Soledar, which is located 10 kilometers, 6 miles, north of Bakhmut, was likely Moscow's immediate military objective and part of a strategy to encircle Bakhmut. An exceptional feature of the fighting near Bakhmut is that some of it has taken place around entrances to disused salt mine tunnels which run for some 200 kilometers, 120 miles, underneath the area, the British intelligence report noted. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu, whose performance has been fiercely criticized in some Russian circles but who has retained Russian President Vladimir Putin's confidence, said Tuesday that his country's military would use its experience in Ukraine to improve combat training. The Kremlin argues that it is not just fighting Ukraine but also its NATO allies. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Tuesday that NATO's members have become a party to the conflict, pumping weapons, technology, and intelligence data into Ukraine. Russia's grinding eastern offensive captured almost all of Luhansk during the summer. Donetsk escaped the same fate, and the Russian military subsequently poured manpower and resources around Bakhmut. Like Mariupol and other contested cities, Bakhmut has endured a long siege, spending weeks without water and power even before Moscow launched massive strikes to take out public utilities across Ukraine. Kirilenko, the Donetsk region's governor, estimated more than 2 months ago that 90% of Bakhmut's pre-war population of over 70,000 had fled since Moscow focused on seizing the entire Donbass. Ukraine's presidential office said at least 4 civilians were killed and another 30 wounded in Russian shelling between Monday and Tuesday. Vitaly Kim, the governor of the southern Mykolaiv region, said Russian forces shelled the port of Ochakiv and the area around it late Monday and then again early Tuesday. He said 15 people, including a 2-year-old child, were wounded in Monday's shelling. The Kremlin said on Tuesday that Ukraine and the West had reacted, cynically, to a 36-hour ceasefire proposed by Russian President Vladimir Putin to mark Orthodox Christmas. One of President Vladimir Putin's closest allies said on Tuesday that Russia was now fighting the US-led NATO military alliance in Ukraine and that the West was trying to rip Russia apart and ultimately wipe it from the political map of the world. A Russian warship armed with hypersonic cruise weapons has held exercises in the Norwegian Sea, the defense ministry said on Tuesday. The frigate is armed with Zircon missiles which Russia says fly at 9 times the speed of sound and have a range of over 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles. Russia sees the weapons as a way to pierce increasingly sophisticated US missile defenses which Putin has warned could one day shoot down Russian nuclear missiles. Thousands of Ukrainian refugees are being housed in hotels as councils struggle to deal with a rising number becoming homeless. Nearly 3,000 Ukrainian households have presented themselves as homeless to English councils since the end of February 2022. The Biden administration said Monday that Iran's sale of lethal drones to Russia for use in its ongoing invasion of Ukraine means the country may be contributing to widespread war crimes. The Ukrainian General Staff has claimed that Russia is conducting offensives in 3 areas. The Russian military is focusing its efforts near Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Lyman, located on the eastern part of Donetsk Oblast, the Ukrainian Army's General Staff said in the latest update from the battle's front lines, adding that the troops from Moscow are looking to push to the administrative border of the oblast. Ukraine is slated to receive $44.9 billion in U.S. aid as part of the recent government spending bill. The U.S. should continue supporting Ukraine until Russian President Vladimir Putin is out of power, King said. He characterized Putin as a dictator. Russia is preparing fresh troops for a renewed major attack on Ukraine and likely the capital Kyiv, the Ukrainian officials, led by the Commander-in-Chief General Valery Zaluzhny, have warned. Ukraine is already getting Patriot anti-missile defense systems and Bradley fighting vehicles from the U.S. in a major arsenal boost, along with lightweight tanks from France in a reluctant assistance as Emmanuel Macron insists on not getting into a direct conflict with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. Looking ahead to a likely spring offensive, the US and Germany are sending Ukraine an array of armored vehicles, including 50 tank-killing Bradleys, to expand its ability to move troops to the front lines and beef up its forces against Russia as the war nears its first anniversary. The vehicles don't fulfill Ukraine's request for combat tanks, but they provide a strategic warfighting capability as the season change brings muddy terrain and Ukraine launches an aggressive campaign to recoup territory taken by Russia, particularly in the east. Kyiv has rejected a Russian claim that a missile strike on a city in Ukraine's Donetsk region killed 600 of its troops, insisting there were no fatalities. Russia's defense ministry had earlier alleged that missiles had hit two makeshift bases housing 1,300 Ukrainian soldiers in the city of Kramatorsk. Its spokesperson Igor Konashenkov said the bombardment had been launched in retaliation for Ukraine's New Year's Eve attack on temporary bases in the eastern city of Makiivka, which killed at least 89 Russian troops. Ukraine is slated to receive $44.9 billion in U.S. aid as part of the recent government spending bill. The U.S. should continue supporting Ukraine until Russian President Vladimir Putin is out of power, King said. He characterized Putin as a dictator. Russia has launched a new, powerful assault led by the Wagner contract militia on Soledar in eastern Ukraine. Describing a difficult situation for forces repelling the attacks, Kyiv made the announcement on Monday. Ukrainian forces successfully repelled an earlier attempt to take the town, but Wagner units quickly returned with fresh tactics and more soldiers. Britain is weighing up supplying Ukraine with tanks for the first time to help the country fight Russian forces, it has been reported. The broadcaster cited one source as saying Britain could offer around 10 Challenger 2 tanks. The move would constitute a major step up in Western support for Ukraine, with the potential to prompt other NATO allies, such as Germany, to emulate. Russia attacked Ukraine on February 24, 2022. January 10, 2023 marks the 321st day of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Invading Russian forces initially tried to advance from the north, east and south, attacking peaceful cities throughout Ukraine. Civilian targets across Ukrainian cities remain under sporadic Russian airstrikes, while settlements along the Russian border are regularly shelled. Since October, the enemy has also been launching Iranian-made suicide drones on Ukrainian cities. The Kremlin has changed the goals of its war in Ukraine several times. Parts of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, Mykolaiv, and Kharkiv oblasts are currently occupied by the enemy. The Ukrainian armed forces launched counteroffensives in the south and east of Ukraine, striking at Russian ammunition depots and personnel concentrations. Almost the entire Kharkiv Oblast was liberated. On November 11, Ukrainian army liberated Kherson and forced Russian forces to withdraw from the western bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. Russian troops have stepped up an assault on the small salt mining town of Soledar in eastern Ukraine, forcing Ukrainian troops to repel waves of attacks led by mercenary forces, officials in Kyiv said. Britain said on Tuesday that Russian and forces of the Wagner contract group were probably now in control of most of the town, in the industrial Donbass region, after advances in the last 4 days. Seizing Soledar would be advantageous to Russian forces as they fight for control of the city of Bakhmut, a few miles, to the southwest, where troops from both sides have been taking heavy losses in some of the most intense trench warfare since Russia invaded Ukraine nearly 11 months ago. Serhiy Cherevity, spokesman for Ukraine's eastern forces, told Ukrainian television Russian forces were deploying their best Wagner fighters at Soledar, which had been struck 86 times by artillery over the past 24 hours. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly video address on Monday that Bakhmut and Soledar were holding on despite widespread destruction. He cited new and fiercer attacks in Soledar, where he said no walls have been left standing and the land was covered with Russian corpses. Bakhmut is located on a strategic supply line between the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which make up the Donbass. Gaining control of it could give Russia a stepping stone to advance on two bigger cities, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Prigozhin has been trying to capture Bakhmut and Soledar for months at the cost of many lives on both sides. Zelensky has repeatedly urged Ukraine's Western supporters to supply more sophisticated weapons to help it repel attacks and eventually expel Russian troops. France, Germany, and the United States all pledged last week to send armored fighting vehicles. The leaders of Ukraine and Russia both vowed to push for victory in New Year speeches, but while Volodymyr Zelensky spoke of gratitude and pain, Vladimir Putin urged duty to Russia, casting the war as a near-existential fight. As the war drags into its 11th month, Moscow was unprepared for the staunch resistance and billions of dollars in Western weapons that have turned the tide in Ukraine's favor. Russian troops have been forced out of more than half the territory they took in the first weeks of what Putin calls a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Kyiv and Western allies say Putin's invasion was a land grab. Russia had planned a swift operation, but with the war dragging on, it has been forced to put society on more of a war footing, calling up more than 300,000 reservists, retooling an economy hurt by Western sanctions, and saying publicly that the conflict may be long. Reiterating that the West is supposedly intent on destroying Russia by using Kyiv, Putin vowed he will never allow that. He signaled once again that the war, albeit hard, will continue. While listing Ukraine's successes, Zelensky referred to the Crimean Bridge, Moscow's symbol of the annexation of the peninsula that linked it with Russia and that was torn by an explosion in October. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said on January 9 that Ukraine expects the European Union to impose sanctions on Russia's nuclear industry, specifically the state nuclear operator Rosatom, in its next package of measures against the country. He made the statement following a meeting with European Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans on January 9. Shmyhal also said that Ukraine is collaborating with European partners on the demilitarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been occupied by Russian forces since early March. The plant, which is located in the Russian-occupied town of Enerhodar in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, has been used as a military base to launch attacks on Ukrainian-controlled territory across the Dnipro River. After staged referendums in September, Russia illegally annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts in Ukraine, including Zaporizhzhia Oblast. The most recent package of EU sanctions against Russia, which was approved in December, includes restrictions in the export, banking, broadcasting, consulting services, energy, and mining sectors, as well as individual sanctions. The military commissar of Russia's Samara Oblast, Oleksiy Vdovin, said that the list of mobilized Russian soldiers killed in Makiivka, an industrial city in Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine, will not be made public, Riga-based Russian independent online newspaper The Insider reported. Ukraine hit a Russian military base in occupied Makiivka in Donetsk Oblast on New Year's Day, killing around 400 soldiers and injuring at least 300, the Strategic Communications Department of Ukraine's military wrote on Telegram. In a rare admission, Russia's defense ministry claimed that 89 Russian soldiers were killed after Ukraine struck the base with 4 US-supplied high-mobility rocket artillery systems, HIMARS. Many of the mobilized soldiers killed in Makiivka were from Russia's southwestern Samara Oblast, according to The Insider. Following the incident, a petition was published demanding that a complete list of names of those killed in Makiivka be published. Vdovin claimed that the names of soldiers who had been killed were provided to the families and that the list could not be published allegedly due to security reasons, The Insider reported. One of President Vladimir Putin's closest allies said on Tuesday that Moscow was now fighting the US-led NATO military alliance in Ukraine and that the West was trying to wipe Russia from the political map of the world. Putin casts the war in Ukraine as an existential battle with an aggressive and arrogant West, and has said that Russia will use all available means to protect itself and its people against any aggressor. The United States has denied Russian claims that it wants to destroy Russia, the world's biggest producer of natural resources, while President Joe Biden has cautioned that a conflict between Russia and NATO could trigger World War III. Russia's February 24 invasion of Ukraine has triggered one of the deadliest European conflicts since World War II and the biggest confrontation between Moscow and the West since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union and United States came closest to intentional nuclear war. The United States and its Western allies have condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an imperial land grab, while Ukraine has vowed to fight until the last Russian soldier is ejected from its territory. As a former Soviet spy who has known Putin since the 1970s, Patrushev's views give an insight into thinking at the very highest levels of the Kremlin. He rebuffed CIA Director William Burns' warnings in 2021 against an invasion of Ukraine. In a Soviet-style analysis of the West, Patrushev cast Western political elites as corrupt and controlled by transnational corporations and business clans which planned and executed color revolutions across the world. Russia, he said, was a victim of Western designs to push it back to the borders of 15th-century Muscovy, and accused the West of bleeding Ukraine to undermine Russia. In between near 24/7 work with the Pentagon to secure much-needed weapons for Ukraine's fight against Russia, the ambassador says she is able to get in touch with her family, affected by Russia's constant attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, when they have power. Since October 10, Russia has launched a series of mass missile and drone attacks at Ukraine, damaging and destroying critical energy infrastructure in the middle of winter. Millions across the country have faced frequent heat, water, and power outages. Markarova says Russia's goal with its attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure is pretty clear: to completely subjugate and occupy Ukraine. According to the ambassador, it's all part of Russia's perennial strategy to absorb Ukraine into its orbit. Even before 2014, when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea, Russia went to lengths to install its puppets in government positions, managing to get its own citizens into leadership positions in Ukraine's defense ministry and security services, she said. American support for Ukraine has been on a roll lately. In late December, the U.S. announced $1.85 billion in military aid to Ukraine, including the first Patriot air defense system, a big hand in protecting Ukraine's skies. Following President Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to Washington, during which he delivered a historic address before Congress on December 21, the U.S. announced more than $3 billion in military aid, this time with the long-awaited Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. During the trip, Zelensky also spoke to leaders of Congress about the possibility of confiscating Russian assets to use as assistance for Ukraine through the Foreign Assistance Act. That made it into the bill just days before it was passed, Markarova said. The recent and seemingly sudden change of heart among Western politicians who earlier claimed sending more advanced weaponry could escalate the war and antagonize Russia is also partly the result of 11 months of empty Russian threats, according to the ambassador. House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Monday that Iran could potentially be contributing to widespread war crimes in Ukraine by supplying its drones to Russia. Sullivan made the remark during President Biden's trip to Mexico City and just weeks after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky raised the issue during his speech to Congress in Washington, D.C. As part of the U.S. response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the government has imposed sanctions on companies and individuals accused of producing or transferring the drones from Iran to Russian President Vladimir Putin's military, Reuters added. The White House first disclosed Tehran's plans to gift Russia hundreds of Shahed-136 drones earlier in 2022, and by August 1,000 Iranian-supplied drones had been shipped to Russia. President Joe Biden kicks off Day 2 of the North American Leaders Summit Tuesday with a bilateral meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where the two leaders are set to discuss clean energy and support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. The meeting will likely build on previous goals established at the G20 conference in Bali last November, where both Biden and Trudeau were present. The meeting also comes weeks after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with Biden in Washington, D.C. and addressed a joint session of Congress to ask for more aid to Ukraine. Congress went on to allocate about $45 billion in additional emergency assistance to Ukraine following Zelensky's remarks. Biden has repeatedly reaffirmed the United States' alliance with Ukraine and has oftentimes turned to other allies to try and get more aid to the country. This is the 10th North American Leaders Summit. Biden held the last one in November 2021 in Washington, D.C. While Biden's meeting with Trudeau will likely be all kumbaya, the meeting between the three leaders could cause some sparks over the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Canada and the United States have to decide whether to go to a dispute settlement panel under USMCA against Mexico for favoring its state-owned energy suppliers. And Canada and Mexico also have their own gripes with the United States. Mexico and Canada have argued the United States is not applying what was agreed upon for USMCA on how to treat autos and cars vehicles. The two countries called for a dispute settlement panel, where they argued that more vehicles should be considered for duty-free shipping.